So I'll introduce to you by now Andrea Pető. She will deliver a talk about the challenges of doing oral history interviews about difficult pasts. Andrea Pető is a historian and a professor at the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University in Vienna, Austria. And she is a research affiliate of the CEU Democracy Institute, Budapest, and a Doctor of Science of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. As I know, there is another academy since a few years, a parallel one. Maybe you will tell us something, but this is once again, other oral history is too complicated, yeah? But I was told by a Hungarian art historian colleague that a certain new academy has emerged under political circumstances. But anyway, it's not the subject of today. Her work on gender, politics, Holocaust, and war have been translated into 23 languages. In 2018, she was awarded the All European Academy's Madame de Staël Prize for Cultural Values and the 2022 University of Oslo Human Rights Award. She's a doctor honoris causa of Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden. Recent publications include The Women of the Arrow Cross Party, Invisible Hungarian Perpetrators in the Second World War, which was published by Paul Grade Macmillan in 2022. And she's also authoring The Forgotten Massacre, Budapest 1944, which was published by the Goethe in 2021. She writes op-ed pieces for many international and national media about academic freedom and illiberal higher education, including the new academy. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being here, and I leave the mic to you.
So, thank you very much for this generous invitation. I'm extremely happy to be here. And you can, of course, ask the question, what the heck a historian is sharing about this very difficult topic. And what I would like to do today is actually showing you an enigma and the relationship between oral histories, difficult past, and representation. Right? And this kind of, because oral histories that we are interviewing the different witnesses, how this is actually considered to be a promise, which will change the world and make it better, and how illiberals are actually hijacking this particular method, and what is the very difficult relationship between oral history and visuality. So that's basically the enigma I would like to unpack you for this talk. And the case study I would like to present to you, difficult past. I mean, Eastern Europe is full of difficult pasts, right? I have picked one which I have been working on the past 30 years, which is sexual violence during wartime. And this is the book which I wrote about sexual violence during the Second World War in Hungary, which turned to be a bestseller, believe me or not. And my publisher did not want to believe it because it was selling like wildfire, which was published in German and it's coming out in Russian. So, yeah. So the structure, yeah. The structure of the talk is that, talking about first this issue of sexual violence during wartime very briefly. And then I will talk about the representation and our recent attempt to erect a memorial in Budapest. And at the last part of the talk, I will like to introduce a small poll here among you, and I would really trust your active participation. So the main argument here is the illiberal memory politics, which is, I would say, bringing in a paradigm change. And this is the main argument. What you see here is that the unashamed citizens, who are the illiberal voters, have been a major force behind progressive movements and revolutions by ignoring and challenging previous orthodoxies, economy of emotions. Different social groups have successfully challenged value systems that were previously seen as unchangeable via a new way of storytelling and visualization. So please take these unashamed citizens as a term with you, because that's, when in 1789, the women marched against Versailles to get the king into Paris. they did not care about what the others were saying. So this unashamed citizen is a very useful term, and especially when we are thinking about how illiberal politics works, ignoring the previous systems of shaming, right? And that sets up a different framework. And the example is the memorialization of sexual violence during wartime. So what the heck is this sexual violence during the Second World War? And this is a very brief history of Hungary during the Second World War, that as an ally of Nazi Germany, as a perpetrator state, it also, the Hungarian forces were occupying forces in Ukraine, Serbia, northern Transylvania, and the Upper Lands. And the 19th of March, Germany occupied Hungary, and then the deportation started. And because the Hungarian state was a collaborating state, that's protected women from the violence. But then when the Red Army liberated the country, there were massive war crimes committed against the civil population, and the numbers are between 80,000 and 800,000. And of course, the Jewish victims, that's a very separate category, and I'm writing a paper now on that, how they were looking at the Red Army as liberators, and of course, they were also raped. And from the illiberal memory politics from the early 2000s, the concept of double victimhood was introduced, namely that Hungary was a victim of the German occupation and the Soviet occupation, which is actually opening up a space for non-taking responsibility in what happened, including the participation of the Hungarian state in the persecution of the Jewish citizens. And this also opened up a space, kind of market for the brutality of the Red Army. And of course, the recent war of Russia against Ukraine again made this topic extremely timely. So there is this conspiracy of silence around this mass phenomenon, because of course it is not only Hungary where the Red Army had been raping, and there is a recent research in Poland which was published like 2 years ago, and there is a new research now in Slovakia. So this is a new phenomenon, and I would like to just flag that this is happening because of this illiberal market is looking for these stories. And of course, sexual violence is always a difficult topic, especially sexual violence during wartime, and because of the lack of sources. So here is a list what kind of sources are possibly available. And if you read my book or the chapters, you will see that, they are sporadic, not representative, and also very much not available. Like the administrative sources, the medical sources are the most reliable, because then the women got pregnant or got sexually transmitted diseases, and then they got into the medical statistics. And there are, of course, private letters. What is missing is the Russian archives on the Red Army, because there is no way that you can get access to that material. There are some novels. There is the church sources, because if the women got raped and got pregnant, they went to the local priest, who actually advised them, surprisingly, that they should get an abortion. And this is also something which is really interesting to follow. And there are several films and interviews. And that's where, we got to the point, namely that I interviewed several women and I started to work on this in 1998 and 1999. Some of you were not even born yet, but still, that's when I started to work on this project. And the stories which had been told, that's the topic what I would like to discuss here, is that at that time, these topics were really not discussed, and they were mostly using the terms from literature. The Dr. Zhivago, the Gun with the Wind, and these stories were using this kind of tropes, which are really interesting. And because the framework of the telling of the stories is changing from a non-framework. In 97, 98, nobody was talking openly about sexual violence committed by the Red Army soldiers, because the anti-fascist leftist framework was very much dominant. So this framework has been changing during my long lifetime, and by now there is a very different framework what you are actually seeing, because this the double occupation, this double victimhood I already mentioned, which created a market for these stories, and also that this is now separately discussed from the Holocaust as a national martyrdom, and also because of the periodization that this usually historians are looking at the history of the Second World War, which finishes in May 1945. But the stories and the lives of individuals are not finishing on the 9th of May, especially not the narration of the stories. And these stories are becoming men's stories by now. So from non-stories and from stories of the Gone with the Wind and the Dr. Zhivago through national martyrdom, now it is becoming a story of men. And I will show you some the film, which is also available at a certain point on the internet, where men are speaking about women being raped. So not the women who are being raped. So I had the privilege of interviewing those women, and they share the stories. But by now, these women are difficult to ask to tell those stories. So what are the ways to talk about the rapes committed by the Red Army soldiers? First, the rape as a weapon of war, which is, of course, the second wave feminism story. And then the structuralist, which is saying that rape is an issue of power, and of course has nothing to do with sexual desire. And also the issue of justice in war and justice in war, because of course the Red Army was waging a just war, but what's happening in the war that was.
It's just a soft. The software is.
Oh. Thank you. So the justice in war and the justice of war, and of course the comparative framework that not only the Red Army was raping, but of course the Allied forces and especially the French occupational forces, and there is always this comparative perspective. So these are the big frameworks influencing the narration. And what is useful to talk about, how to talk about difficult past, is the concept of the floating gap, which is Van Zina's term, who is an oral historian, that there is always a floating gap which makes certain stories tellable and some stories are untellable. And the sexual violence committed by the Red Army soldiers, which was a massive phenomenon, sometimes this is in the gap, in the floating gap, sometimes it is not. And the framework in which this story is being told is always changing, from literary concepts till martyrdom, and also the issue of the Hungarian nations, so-called Hungarian nations suffering from the Soviet occupation. And so let's sum up the issue about narratives. So this kind of previous frameworks of intentionalist, structuralist debate or militarism power relation has been replaced by this national framework, and there it's really the complexity of narration is our obligation. And now comes the visual representation. So I hope that I argued that this is the sexual violence committed during the Second World War. It's a difficult topic. The narrative frameworks are changing. So let's see the visuality. And I would like to send a trigger warning, because the photos I will be showing will be difficult, and you might want to also not use that when you are putting up on the web page. So so when we are talking about the visualization, then of course they are informed by the different testimonies, right? So the rape happening, then the story is told in different ways, and I was showing you how it has been told, and then the artist is representing it, or somebody is representing it, and now we are looking at again. So this kind of visuality had been informed by the oral histories, and also the how certain victims are becoming the privileged victims because of the illiberal turn, and this kind of visual narrative of sexual violence during the Second World War. And there hadn't been too many photos. So, and of course, neither the victim nor the perpetrators were interested in, or they could never make these photos. So, based on what the representation is happening. So, this is the photo from 1945 from Vienna. There are several police photos of the Soviet occupation of Vienna. That in the morning, the Austrian police found bodies of women on the streets, massive amount of bodies, and then they recorded that they have been raped, and of course, the perpetrator is unknown because, of course, the Soviet army was outside the jurisdiction. Here is another famous photo from Kaldej, whom some of you might know, who made this photo of the erecting the red flag on the Reichstag. This is the photo he made in Budapest, and this photo became, which has got a very troubled history, which I don't have time to talk about this. This became the symbol of the massive rape committed during the Second World War. So, what is this illiberal memory turn I have been mentioning? First of all, there is this her story turn, namely that it speaks a lot about women. So this feminist argument that let's add women, let's show women, it is basically superficial because there are lots of women here, but women are represented as the body of the nation, and they are very much visible in this motherhood and suffering framework. There is a populist turn in choosing these topics, and also there is a localized research. They are focusing on the local context. Of course, I mentioned the double victimhood or this bloodlands, and it is hijacking shame and trauma narratives by these ashamed citizens. So what we see is that the illiberal turn is hijacking the shame which has been previously made, the sexual violence invisible, in order to show the Hungarian victimhood and somehow suppress the Hungarian responsibility for the Second World War. And it standardizes oral history. So if you look at this film, which is available with English subtitles, you see that the stories are standardized. So in the past 5 years, from non-stories, it became standardized, that only Soviet soldiers wearing uniform and very visible red star with Asiatic features are raping. So this is the kind of standardized story. And of course, this is the most important symbolic piece of this illiberal turn, the Liberty Square monument of the German occupation, which was parachuted during night at the Liberty Square in the center of Budapest, where you see in the center the Archangel Gabriel representing Hungary as the innocent victim, and the Imperial Eagle of Germany going and being responsible for everything. So, how do you represent a story, an event, which you don't have much sources, but testimonies, which are collected in a very specific framework, and this is about a very difficult past. So, what are the previous memorials? And of course, I'm sure you know the so-called comfort women statues, which are a result of Korean NGOs, feminist NGOs, who were fighting relentlessly that the Japanese government would acknowledge the responsibility of these military brothels, where hundreds of thousands of different women were prisoned. And this also became a kind of moving memorial because they set up the same memorial in different places. This is in Seoul, but this is in the US, in Glendale, and please acknowledge the iconography. You are much better in art history than myself, so please acknowledge this romanticized kind of youngish victim and the empty chair. the empty chair, which invites you to sit down and listen to those stories. And of course, this iconography became a symbol, and there are several performances. This is a different iconography, and this is also the victim of the comfort women, but this is somehow again going back to the 19th century romantic iconography. And this is again another comfort woman statue. It's in Indonesia, and I would like to underline that when this was erected, then the Japanese embassy sent a note to the Indonesian government saying if they don't move this, then the economic relations will suffer. And accidentally turned out they had to change the channelization below this statue, so they removed the statue, and even the statue had been disappeared from the workshop of the artist. So it shows that this is really a hot memory, to use Charles Meyer's term. And this is also in Kreuzberg. Some of you might have followed the debate how the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, following the ukaz coming from the Japanese embassy, wanted to force the Kreuzberg district to remove this statue, who immediately organized a civil action, and it is still there. This is in Bangladesh, when the Pakistani soldiers were raping in 1971. Please look at the iconography, and the point is to connect it with the visual representation and the oral histories. What are those in Eastern Europe? Sanja Ivakovic has this Rosa de Luxembourg statue, which is, of course, well known. And there's in Gdansk in 2013 this guerrilla monument, which was set up during night. Please remember my slide when I was mentioning that the liberal government was parachuting that statue into the center of Budapest. This monument, the Gdansk Memorial, was also parachuted during night without any previous discussion or approval. But since they did not have the permit to have this memorial, then the artist was arrested, and then the memorial was removed. But this monument is exactly the translation of the oral stories into a visual narrative. So, but there are, of course, different frameworks, not only this one-to-one translation of the oral histories to visual representation. One of them is in Kosovo. So you see in the right corner these traditional 2,000 coins, which are representing the Albanian women, this 20,000, which is the number of women raped by the Serbian soldiers. And there is the other one, which is in a soccer stadium, every family where somebody was raped, they were asking for a piece of clothes. And this was a temporary exhibition, which is a very different framework because it somehow includes those who were also raped. And the famous Doris Salcedo's, which is in Colombia, when there was the peace process, they taken the weapons, and they invited the women who were the victims of rape to work on that material and to work out the anger and the frustration here. So what's the situation in Hungary? There are two existing memorials, and one is in Csongrád, which is one of the southern parts of Hungary, and then you see this plaque, and it is a quote from the Revelations. And if you would look at this plaque, you would say that it is not necessarily a plaque for commemorating the women who were raped by the Red Army soldiers. And that is probably the reason why it could be erected, because you know the Hungarian government has got very strong connections with the Putin's government. And also it is still existing, right? So that, because of this enigmatic narrative style. So on the one hand, you have the a very traditional 19th century iconography, plus a narrative, which is a coded narrative. And that is also true for the other memorial, which the text of this memorial would not tell you that this is actually a memorial for the massive rape committed by the Red Army soldiers. You can only know this if you read the interviews with this gentleman who actually financed this story. So, and now I arrive to the present, the competition. So you have seen the illiberals are hijacking the narrative about the sexual violence committed during the Second World War, and then the Municipal of Budapest, which is an oppositional coalition which is running the government of the Municipal Budapest, decided in a bipartisan way, which is very rare in the polarized Hungarian politics, to start a memorial for the women victims of the sexual violence and rape. And this is an international competition, and the jury was headed by James Young, who was always, the head of the different competitions. And the preparation started with a professional and a civic dialogue, and we were trying to offer, because I was also a part of this project, an alternative to illiberal memory politics, which is parachuting monuments in the middle of the city, but rather offering dialogue. So what I will do is, there were 37 proposals, and 6 were shortlisted by this international jury led by James Young. And I will show you the 6 plans, and I will ask you to keep a mental note, whom would you vote for? And at the end, I will ask you to vote, and then I will tell you which one was selected by the international jury led by James Young, and which one, there was a poll by one of these internet journals, and more than 100,000 people voted. So which one came out as the first one, right? So, and that is what I think is the most important question, namely the iconography, the connection with narrative, and the difficult past, and how oral histories and orality informs working through the past. So here is the first one, which is called Memory of Rape in War Times. And this is a slot in the Buda part of Budapest, which was destroyed during the Second World War. And this is a corridor where the visitor can walk in. There is a poem which was written about the victims of the sexual violence. And it's a place of retreat and mourning and healing. And while the visitor is walking in this corridor, which is difficult to see because it is moved, then rethinking and taking part actively in the coming to terms with the past. So this is the memory of the rapes in wartime. The second one is the same place, but this is the swept under the carpet. And in the middle, there is a nightgown, a white nightgown of a woman with blood stains. And then there are the different garden places, which is, you can walk on this nightgown, and you can also look at the spectator's position oscillates between an observer and a participant, right? Then the third one is the sound of silence. I'm sorry, I forgot to put that. The sound of silence. This is in the Margaret Island, and it is coming up and going down this monument. And you can put messages in the holes of this monument, and it also collects stories through these stories you are putting into this monument, invites the participant to be a part of this story. The fourth one is the caryatids, and this is also in the same slot where the first two were. And there is a quote from the book of Ecclesiastes about violence and suffering, and you see the tiny 12 women, the caryatids, and above them this huge column, and at the top there is the description of the caryatid, of the quote from the Ecclesiastes. And here is the silence, which is again on the same spot. There are small little flower beds, and then certain porcelain figurines inspired by Ovid metamorphosis. And then the visitors are actually, working with these small nightingales. And it's an active, involving participation and evocation and commemoration. And the last one is the broken silence, which is again in the same slot, that the visitors are entering into this slot which has been destroyed during the Second World War. And then there are these circular things which are representing to the moon, because women are connected to moon. And then there is also a sound which is dependent on where we are at the moon cycle. So these are the 6 shortlisted pieces. So let me just very quickly go through it, and then you can make your mind, and then I will ask you to choose. So this is the first one. Now, the first one, the memory of the rape, then the swept under the carpet, then the sound of silence, then the caryatids, then the silenced, and then the broken silence. So you see that the silence is they're always playing with the silence, of course. I want to believe that because they have read my book about the silencing. Okay, so the first, who would vote for the memory of the rape? 1. Okay. Swept under the carpet? 1. Okay. The sound of silence, which is in the Danube? The caryatids? 1, 2, 3. Okay. The silence, which is this nightingale, Ovid, whatever. And then the broken silence. 2, 3. Interesting, interesting. So let me show you then the results. So the memory of the rape, which only Erwin was voting. This was actually the first which the international jury, because that I mean that is the language. That is the international language of commemoration, right? And that's, I think, is really an issue. And that's, we were talking when we are coming here with Philip about, what are the conflict between me and Andrea Pető, because I mean, she is also a fantastic art historian, but that's what she can see, like what Erwin can see. But the audience and the people and they are seeing it totally differently. And then the popular vote went for the swept under the carpet, when you can walk on this very simple thing, and then the caryatids, and then the broken silence, and the memory of rape in war times was the last one. And I think here we have a problem. And the problem is that how, this, so there is a representation which is following the oral histories, right? You see soldiers raping, soldiers, pulling women. This is one story. But the other story, when you are actually applying the international language of art and art history for something which is actually has got this very different frames of narration. And especially when the liberals are so fantastically and usefully hijacking this particular language. So that's what I wanted to, leave you with, especially because we are here in a fantastic modern art museum. So what is the language we are actually expecting from the artist to use? And is this language which is actually resonating with the informed audience, right? And so this is the book on which this paper was based. So I wonder if you have got any questions. That's what I wanted to leave you with, this enigma, which I don't really know the answer, but we have got fantastic debates about this.
So who has some questions about the presentation of Andrea? Who has? Still.
Then this works. So.
Yeah, that one
So
it's working. The questions are very important.
Yeah, if you have got questions.
Yeah, it's coming now. It's coming now. Microphone is coming?
We hope so.
Okay.
We're changing the batteries.
Take this one. Yeah. It's just about that.
Yeah, so it's not so much of a question, but maybe I was, when you were showing the projects, those proposals, the first one was, it was maybe not so clear, for example, to me when I first saw it, because the graphic here, the image, it would probably require a little bit more of a elucidation, because that's the idea with this kind of projects which are, as you said, which reflect contemporary way of thinking about memory, about those gaps, about those silences, and so on and so forth. Well, James Young wrote a lot about such counter or anti-monuments, which actually reveal the work of memory, which is full of gaps, full of niches and stuff like that. Well, it got me interested. I voted for a different one for Karate because it was more immediate. When you showed it, it's like, it is kind of interesting because Karate is so rooted in the art history, and it's always women. Well, there are atlases as well, but those women which sort of carry things, yeah, and it's sort of it is intelligent, but it's more straightforward. But I totally agree that those monuments which sort of require some kind of a, I would say, making you think about the way that that you cannot remember, about not being able to remember, not being able to experience something that you have not experienced. Yeah, you can only vicariously somehow, share it somehow. So that's just, it's not so much of a question, but more of a. And one more thing, which is not about the sexual violence. When you talked about those projects, and I really hate those monuments that you were showing, like at the beginning. They're so simple, conservative, showing like the figural women just as statues. The idea, of course, it's valuable, it's important, and so on and so forth. But really, it does not convey the idea of this experience at all. Yeah. But when you talked about it, I was thinking about some of the projections of video projections and projects of Krzysztof Wodliczko, for example. Of course, it's not related directly to war victims of sexual violence, but for example, the one which he made at the border in Tijuana, at the border between Mexico and the US. So I think it's, and you have oral accounts of women being sexually violated, raped in that region because of the drug thing and so on and so forth. So and I really appreciate it. I was wondering, how would you comment on Wodliczko's way of representing or addressing or giving voice to those victims, sexual violence victims, slightly in a different context, of course, from what you were talking about. But I think his work is really valid. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. So if you are going to the web page of the project, that is silence.hu, then you see Andrea Pető speaking about this particular project. So I mean, it's but the question is, and that's where I started the presentation, that can we give a voice, right? And when we have got this giving the voice to the victims, it's basically hijacked by the liberal forces. That's what we see, and that's why it is so resonating, the caryatids. I mean, they are always the hit wherever I go and present this kind of, the because it's simple, right? And but I mean, I take the criticism that this photo is not the best one, but I took it from the winning memorial, which will be erected for the 150th anniversary of the foundation of Budapest, or the unification of Budapest, sorry. And this I took from their application, so they used it. So anyway, but this inviting the audience to come in and do something. It's a very interventionist and active participation and opening space and whatever. But yeah, there is a resistance to this kind of enlightened approach. And that's what, we have got this discussion with art historians when we had this, what is the role of the art historian? To an enlightened scholar who is telling what the others should do? I mean, and then that's when the unashamed citizens are simply saying no. No, I mean, I have my own story. I have got my own way of voting for the caryatids or for this. This is the winning memorial by this vote by 100,000 people. And I don't need the art historians to come and translate and bring me the transnational language of art history. I'm not saying I know the solution for this. I just want to address here, because I think, in a Museum of Contemporary Art, I think this is the $1 million to ask, actually. So thanks a lot.
Thank you both of you. I would still have something like a question, or like Philip said, mostly a comment. Somehow, I feel guilty because I was choosing the one which was chosen by the international jury. That means it's international thinking applied to a national issue, which is very, very difficult. And I make my own, mea culpa through reading my own background. So I totally read the piece as a work of art. So the only one project which looked like a work of art was Ilona Nemeth piece. So my thinking was, and my perception was purely formalist, not even functional. So I took it as a work of art. And the second point, which is consistent with what you said, it's a very international pattern. I introduced it in a series, in a kind of drawer, So which is convenient to my thinking as an art historian, because I can be interested by the theme, or I cannot be interested by the theme. I can be in a jury without being interested in the subject matter. I'm there to judge somehow. For example, if you are an engineer, you are not there in the jury to judge if the work is addressing moral issues. You are there to judge if the walls of the monument will fall on the visitors. So you judge from a very different point of view. These are different ways of world making, as Nelson Goodman would point. So my perception was purely formalist, but at the same time, I would really address the main subject matter, because the big difference between the monuments, the first monuments, say the literal monuments, and the non-literal, somehow allegoric monuments. So the first monuments you've been showing are not only dated, but they are literal. The later monuments are not dated because they are not literal. They are allegoric. And we live mostly in an allegorical reading of our own society. We don't want to see that. You remember yourself saying, maybe you'll be troubled by showing those photographs. So it was a disclaimer from your, the disclaimer, it's somehow saying, I'm somehow trespassing the allegorical framework. This was your disclaimer. We are used now to do this, but before we are not used. Just showing this is a thing. So the earlier monuments were, this is a thing. It's literal. And today's, and those monuments somehow succeeded, or even wanted, to preserve and prolongate the sufferance, to make it more active. Today's monuments are focused on healing, on somehow closing the whole issue, on somehow obliterating it. And in the matter of obliteration, Ilona Nemeth was the best. It was a space of healing, not of prolongating the sufferance. So I think she was close. So my option was not my option. I knew when I voted for it, I knew that was the choice. I was sure that it was the choice, because I understood my own, process. But this process is a social process too, intellectual and social processes too.
Which doesn't resonate to the public. And here we have a problem.
Yes, but who's the public, In art world, the public is the art milieu. We know that. Sorry.
I know, but I know, but
It's an American issue, you know.
Yeah,
George Dickey and Arthur Dento is the artwork.
That's what I think is, that's why this conference and this whole issue is so important.
Yeah, yeah.
Who is the audience?
Absolutely.
Who is the audience?
Absolutely.
And when the municipal of Budapest decided to finance this thing, although it's totally bankrupt because the government is taking all the money, they did this because they hoped to open up for a wider discussion. And that's why we had podcasts, we have got lecture series. I mean, we try to bring in and invite the audience for a discussion.
But it is not possible because the art world is closed.
It's closed.
Yeah, that's what
But
that was my point.
closed for us, but not for the liberals. That's the point.
I think the liberals are a
That's
temporary
the
matter. Are a temporary matter,
I wish
whereas
you
the
were
art world
right.
is
I wish you were
eternal.
right. We will discuss it during lunch and dinner, but I think that the illiberal turn in this present moment of neoliberal neo-fascism, what we are living now,
It's
I
already
think
long.
it will be long, and I'm not sure I will see this gone. So, but
Let's hope be a bit
Yeah, but-
more optimistic.
okay, but this is an important point, and I would like you to go away with this, that my argument was that there is this art world is basically unable to address those issues which the illiberal, you can call it figurative or whatever, art world is able to open up. And then there are thousands of people going for these horrible illiberal monuments, and they consider them their own, while these kind of artistic representations are like just oil spot at the floating on the water
Surface.
and the surface. And I'm not sure how long this is sustainable. This is my sad
Okay.
message, and thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Andrea.